Brazil represented almost half of the entire transatlantic slave trade. Before the North American slave trade got started, more enslaved people had been brought to Brazil than would ever reach British North America. The nation was by far the largest importer of enslaved people in the Americas throughout the 17th century. In this 12th session of the series, Time for the Nations to Reap, we will look at how the original inhabitants of Brazil were whited out. Let's begin by reading excerpts from this article from New York Amsterdam News entitled, "Lawyers Call on Brazil to Apologize for African Slavery." So Brazil's National Bar Association, made up of lawyers, academics, activists, and consultants, called on the federal government to present a formal apology for African slavery. So they came up with a commission, and they named themselves the National Commission for Truth About Black Slavery in Brazil. And they wrote a 316-page report. And the commission details the history of African enslavement in the South American nation, and they looked at what life was like for the enslaved blacks while living under laws and within societies created by the Empire of Brazil, the Kingdom of Portugal, and the Catholic Church. So it lists the crimes that were practiced against innocent blacks by the individuals or the groups I just named. It says these crimes could not have occurred if Brazil, Portugal, and the Catholic Church had not collaborated, each playing a crucial role in a criminal network. So it says the crimes committed included kidnapping, tearing African people from their families and communities never to be returned, abduction, and the kidnappers forcing their victims to work in agriculture while awaiting the ships that would transport the victims off to slavery. Continuing, it says in the mid-1450s, the Catholic Church's Pope Nicholas V granted Portugal a monopoly on specifically enslaving sub-Saharan Africans through a papal bull. The Church of Rome, justified this act by claiming that although their bodies were enslaved, the Church was saving their souls by mandating that each victim of the slave trade be baptized into Christianity. Listen, it says, one of the central missions of the report is to debunk the popular myth that has been promoted internationally that African slavery in Brazil was somehow milder, utilized less enforced labor, and was of a more cordial nature than was found in places such as the United States and other nations founded upon slavery. Now I want to read some excerpts from this article from Alternative History entitled Empire of Brazil, the Unexpected Kingdom, because there is a main point here that we cannot overlook, and that is the fact that it was not the original inhabitants of Brazil who were enslaving our people. No, it was the European colonizers. So it says the Empire of Brazil was South America's largest nation and was one of its most stable nations at that. It had zealously guarded political, religious, and speech institutions that were South America's best. So as a colony of the Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil became the seat of the Portuguese colonial empire in 1808, when the Portuguese Prince Regent, later King Dom John VI, fled from Napoleon I's invasion of Portugal and established himself and his government in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro. So John VI later returned to Portugal, leaving his eldest son and heir, Pedro, to rule Brazil as regent. Continuing, it says the territory which would come to be known as Brazil was claimed by Portugal on the 22nd of April 1500, when the navigator Pedro Alvarez Cabral landed on its coast. Permanent settlement followed in 1532, and Portuguese slowly expanded westwards until they had reached their Spanish neighbors. In 1808, the army of French Emperor Napoleon I invaded Portugal, forcing the Portuguese royal family, the House of Bragança, a branch of the 1,000-year-old Capetian dynasty, into exile. They re-established themselves in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro, which became the unofficial seat of the Portuguese Empire. So who are we really talking about here as it pertains to slavery in Brazil? Once again, we're talking about Portugal. So let's look at this article from World History Encyclopedia. It says, with a wealth of natural resources, Brazil was by far the most important colony in the Portuguese Empire and was at one time or another the world's leading producer of sugar, diamonds, and tobacco. Colonized from the 1530s, most settlements were coastal towns until the interior was exploited, bringing further conflict with the Amerindians. So it says importing a massive number of slaves from Africa. Brazilian society became multicultural but remained dominated by white Europeans. It goes on to say that the first Portuguese settlement in Brazil was at São Vicente in 1532. Several hundred colonists came by ship to set up these colonies, which grew in number along the Brazilian coast. Territories were handed out by the crown in the form of 15 feudal grants or captaincies, which obliged the nobles, or more accurately their vassals, to develop land for agriculture. So they just started giving away the land that belonged to the original inhabitants, just like they did here in America. And you can see the color of some of the original inhabitants on the right. And they called them Amerindians, just gave them a name. Oh, the arrogancy. But let's go on. It says the captaincy model had been used with success on Portugal's North Atlantic island colonies, but colonial development was slow in Brazil. The quality of immigrants was low, with plenty of unscrupulous adventurers and social undesirables mixed in with the genuine settler farmers, churchmen, and those seeking freedom from religious persecution, like Jews and converted Jews, or those they called New Christians. And we talked about them. So it says, consequently, the crown appointed a governor in 1549 to bring some order and push things along. Brazil was made an official crown colony, and the capital was established at Salvador da Bahia, where a hospital, prison, cathedral, fortification walls, and custom house was built. So it says the Europeans were a little perplexed by the indigenous Brazilians. They seemed to have no property or ruler, no political system, no ranking in their society, and no belief in the soul. Haven't we heard this before? It's the same thing they said about the Congo. So when they want to come in and take away people's lands, their resources, any excuse will do. Funny how the native people managed to live there and take care of themselves long before the Europeans got there. But let's go on. So they also said early explorers told of cannibalism, ruthless warfare between tribes, and even human sacrifices. Again, they're telling on themselves. Undoubtedly, the Europeans were unable to appreciate or comprehend the culture of these Tupi-Guarani Amerindians, as they came to be called by outsiders. So it says, oh my goodness, just as in other parts of the empire, the Portuguese were here only to exploit the local resources, and only missionaries took an interest in the people who had lived across South America undisturbed for millennia and studied the native languages, and we know why, so that they could convert them to Christianity. Let's keep going. It says peaceful and occasional trade relations with the indigenous populations soon deteriorated into hostilities. The Portuguese subdued any Amerindians intent on warfare. So we know what this means. The Amerindians tried to fight back and get back what was stolen from them. And that's when the Portuguese attacked them, called them enemies, saying, you're trying to go to war with us because how dare you object to us coming in here and taking your land and your resources and erasing your identity? Don't you know we're doing this for your own good? We're trying to civilize you people. Oh gosh, let's go on. It says they subdued any Amerindians intent on warfare and attempted to use the more peaceful Amerindians as labor, as slaves, in other words. But this was not a work Amerindian men usually did, and they easily escaped back to their forests at the earliest opportunity because they knew the landscape. It says the Portuguese used Amerindians captured by more friendly tribes as slaves. They launched their own slave hunting expeditions, and missionaries forced Amerindians to live in mission villages, controlled by such organizations as the Jesuit Society. Why are we not surprised? By the 1560s, Amerindian society was breaking down. Tens of thousands had been killed by European diseases like smallpox, and most of those who remained free abandoned their settlements and moved far into the interior of Brazil. Colonial expansion soon caught many of them up in a bloody war of extermination. The Palestinians would know something about that. Let's go on. It says the Portuguese had developed a successful plantation system to grow sugarcane in colonies like Sao Tome and Principe, a labor-intensive crop. Slaves had been brought from nearby West Africa to work on the plantations. The system was then applied on an even larger scale in colonial Brazil from the 1530s, where the availability of land was much greater. The first plantations were at Pernambuco, São Vicente, and Rio. Within a few decades, Brazil had become the world's largest producer of sugar. In 1570, Brazil had 60 sugar mills. By 1645, there were 350. So now we'll see how they got our people to do the work. Slaves for the plantations were initially acquired locally, but from 1570 enslaving the Amerindians was prohibited. Most slaves, therefore, came by ship from Africa, particularly Portuguese Angola. Brazil was by far the largest importer of slaves in the Americas throughout the 17th century, when Brazilian sugar production was at its peak. From 1600 to 1625, 150,000 African slaves were brought across the Atlantic. In the entire history of the Atlantic slave trade, around 1/3 of all slaves went in Portuguese ships to Brazil and for resale to Spanish colonies. 1 in 5 slaves never survived the horrendous conditions of transportation on board cramped, filthy ships. The voyage to Rio was one of the longest and took 60 days. African slaves had to learn the local language, which was Creole Portuguese. More skilled labor came from immigrants, many of whom came from Portuguese colonies in the North Atlantic, which suffered badly from the large-scale sugar production in Brazil. So again, when speaking about slavery in Brazil, we are talking about European colonizers enslaving our people and trafficking them to Brazil. So I'm going to look at this article from Brown EDU entitled The Changing Economy of Colonial Brazil. It says the first Portuguese settlers of Brazil were not seeking a colony in which to live, but rather a trading post, like they did in West Africa. It says Portugal's small size and population made sending its citizens to other parts of the world impracticable. So the country established a worldwide network of military defended trading forts that harnessed local labor to bring resources to merchants who in turn brought those foreign products to the European markets. Portuguese fortified trade posts were called feitorias, meaning factories. They sent them to the factory, you all. It says the merchants using them dealt in a number of different goods, primarily Brazil wood, but also more exotic items such as parrots and animal skins. They were all encompassing sites of business, serving as markets, warehouses, customs houses, and support sites for navigation. But as the French, Spanish, English, and Dutch increasingly clashed with the Portuguese over trade sites and routes, militarization became a key part of overseas trade. So let's see what life was like for them. It says the following is an account from a French cotton buyer in Pernambuco. So Louis Francois de Tollenaire, who observed the various races and classes involved in agriculture in the colony and how they interacted, gave this analysis. He identifies different classes of free men, from the wealthy landowners to the landless itinerant workers. So Tollenaire later discusses the customs of different groups of slaves on the large sugar plantations. Listen, these are his words. I will divide the inhabitants of these regions into 3 classes. I am not speaking of the slaves who are nothing but cattle. He's not talking about the slaves. They're only cattle. So he's talking about these 3 classes, and they are the owners of sugar mills. These are the great landowners. The labradors, a type of tenant farmer, and the moradors, they're squatters or small cultivators. He says the sugar mill owners are those who early received land grants from the crown by donation or transfer. In other words, they gave them the land. They gave them the land. Let's keep going. We'll look at this article from the Wilson Center, and it's about slavery in Brazil. It says on May 13, 1888, Brazilian Princess Isabel of Bragança signed Imperial Law number 3353. Although it contained just 18 words, it is one of the most important pieces of legislation in Brazilian history, called the Golden Law. It abolished slavery in all its forms. For 350 years, slavery was the heart of the Brazilian economy. According to historian Emília Viate da Costa, 40% of the 10 million enslaved Africans brought to the New World ended up in Brazil. That's a lot of people. Enslaved persons were so pivotal to the economy that Ina von Binzer, a German educator who lived in Brazil in the late 1800s, wrote, "In this country, the blacks occupy the main role. They are responsible for all the labor and produce all the wealth in this land." Listen, the white Brazilian just doesn't work. By 1888, abolition had the support of most Brazilians, including several conservative sectors, the culmination of a long process of societal and economic changes. By the time slavery was abolished, the practice had already begun to decrease due to the modernization of agriculture and increasing migration towards Brazil's cities from rural areas. So it says, yet the shift took nearly 70 years. Great Britain outlawed slavery in 1807 and subsequently began to pressure other nations to follow suit, including Brazil upon its independence from Portugal. However, in 1822, 1.5 million of 3.5 million people in Brazil were enslaved, and the practice was not simply tolerated, but strongly supported by all segments of society, including the Catholic Church. It goes on to say, yet in the years that followed, Great Britain ramped up efforts to outlaw the slave trade, seizing slave ships in the Atlantic Ocean, and even attacking a few ports in Brazil. As a result, the Brazilian government passed a law declaring that all enslaved persons were free upon reaching Brazilian soil, though the government did not enforce the law. As British ships made life harder for slave traders, the supply of slave labor declined and enslaved persons became more expensive. Initially, this forced owners to improve living and working conditions, as they could no longer afford the high mortality rates that previously categorized the practice of slavery in Brazil. It says landowners became increasingly aware that slave labor was making less and less economic sense. Paying low salaries to free men was in fact cheaper than maintaining slaves for whom the owners were responsible. Thus, the Brazilian government began implementing policies aimed at gradually reducing slavery, although it moved slowly to avoid disturbing owners' economic interests. Now pay attention here so that you can see just how devious these folks are. Listen to the plan that they implemented when they outlawed slavery in Brazil. It says, indeed, Brazilian elites largely opposed to the idea that Brazil would have a majority Afro-Brazilian citizenry. So it was the Brazilian elites that came up with this plan. Listen, after slavery was formally abolished as a legal institution, the government implemented a policy of branqueamento, or whitening, a state-sponsored attempt to improve the bloodline through immigration. They wanted to improve the bloodline. So how did they do it? Brazil was to accept only, underline only, white Europeans or Asian immigrants. Meanwhile, with nowhere to go and no other way to earn a living, many freed slaves entered into informal agreements with their former owners. These amounted to food and shelter in exchange for free labor, thereby maintaining the status quo. You all. So they implement this policy to white them out. Basically, they whited them out. So let's look at this article from Atlanta Black Star, because they're listing 5 nations that imported Europeans to whiten the population. So I'll focus primarily on Brazil, and I'll name the other 4. It says, after the transatlantic slave trade was officially abolished toward the end of the 19th century, many whites felt threatened. I wonder why they feel threatened by us, and feared free blacks would become dominant in the society. The elites spent a great deal of time mulling over how best to solve the so-called Negro problem, and they're still doing it today. Genocide. It says a popular solution that emerged during this period was the ideology of racial whitening. Let's go on. And I'm sure most of you know some of this already if you watch the Whited Out series by Watchman and DeBoer. But it says supporters of the whitening ideology believed that if a superior white population was encouraged to mix with an inferior black population, blacks would advance culturally, genetically, or even disappear totally within several generations. Some also believed that an influx of immigrants from Europe would be necessary to successfully carry out the process. Although both ideologies were driven by racism and white supremacy, whitening was in contrast to some countries that opted for segregation rather than miscegenation, ultimately outlawing the mixing of the races. That's what they did here in the United States. Only thing is, they were already doing that. It just wasn't the law. Why were all of these white slave masters raping the women? They were already doing that here. So it says this, however, was just a different means to the same end, as these nations also imported more Europeans while slaughtering and oppressing the black population. So here are 5 of the several countries that adopted a whitening policy and what happened as a result. So let's look at this. And again, we're focusing on Brazil. It says Brazil's whitening ideology gained support from 2 pseudoscientific racist beliefs that were prominent during this time. One being social Darwinism, which applied Darwin's theory of natural selection to a society or race, and the other being Aryanism, the belief that the white Aryan race was superior to all other cultures. Remember, we're talking about the same people group, you all, the Yamnaya people, the Indo-Europeans. They move in and wipe out the indigenous people and populate or repopulate the land with their bloodline. Same playbook. It says, by combining these two ideas, a certain portion of the Brazilian power elite believed from roughly 1880 on that the nation could be whitened and thus improved if whites were encouraged to mate with blacks. To further ensure that Brazil became whiter, a series of laws were passed prohibiting the immigration of black people to the country. So they issued a decree in 1945, and the government was basically favoring the entrance of European immigrants. Listen to the quote: "In the admission of immigrants, the need to preserve and develop in the ethnic composition of the population the more convenient features of their European ancestry shall be considered." So because of Brazil's racist miscegenation agenda, lighter skin became valued more among Brazilians of African heritage, and that's still the case today. And darker-skinned individuals sought lighter-skinned partners, since the surest way to gain upward mobility is to possess whiter skin than your parents. Some of the other nations on the list include Cuba. Jamaica is on the list. Yes, Jamaica. South Africa. It says the apartheid system was designed to maintain white domination in South Africa, and the associated immigration laws implemented during white rule reflected that ideology. And rounding out the list is Australia. Look at the sign, March of the Great White Policy. Australia, the white man's land. So let's look at this article from the University of Houston, and it's entitled American Slavery in Comparative Perspective. It's asking, how did American slavery compare and contrast with slavery in Latin America and the Caribbean? Was it more repressive or was it more benign? So for a long time it was widely assumed that Southern slavery was harsher and crueler than slavery in Latin America, where the Catholic Church insisted that slaves had a right to marry, to seek relief from a cruel master, and to purchase their freedom. It says this contrast between a supposedly kinder, gentler system of Latin American slavery and a harsher system of North American slavery appears to be grossly overdrawn. In practice, neither the Catholic Church nor the courts offered much protection to Latin American slaves. Cruel punishments were not unknown, such as tying slaves down and flogging them for 9 to 13 consecutive days. Slave owners in Latin America, like those in the American South, frequently sold slaves apart. Access to freedom was greater in Latin America, but in many cases, masters freed sick, elderly, crippled, or simply unneeded slaves in order to relieve themselves of financial responsibilities. Interesting, right? It says in certain respects, Latin American slavery may have been even harsher than North American slavery. Death rates among slaves in the Caribbean were 1/3 higher than in the South, and suicide appears to have been much more common. Sometimes Latin American slaves were forced to wear iron masks to keep them from eating dirt or drinking liquor. Unlike slaves in the South, West Indian slaves were expected to produce their own food in their free time and care for the elderly and the infirm. For all the similarities between slavery in the American South and in Latin America, there were a number of crucial differences. Perhaps the most obvious were demographic. The slave population in Brazil and the West Indies had a low proportion of female slaves, a tiny slave birth rate, and a high proportion of recent arrivals from Africa. In striking contrast, Southern slaves had an equal sex ratio, a high birth rate, and a predominantly American-born population because they were breeding them. By the mid-19th century, U.S. slaves were much further removed from Africa than those in the Caribbean, while a majority of early 19th century slaves in the British Caribbean and Brazil were born in Africa. In 1850, most U.S. slaves were third, fourth, or fifth generation Americans. In addition, by the 19th century, there were relatively few African-born slaves, which made it more difficult to maintain African practices in an unmodified form. It goes on to say slavery in the United States was especially distinctive in the ability of the slave population to increase its numbers by natural reproduction. In the Caribbean, Dutch Guyana, and Brazil, the slave death rate was so high and the birth rate so low that slaves could not sustain their population without imports from Africa. Rates of natural decrease ran as high as 5% a year, while the death rate of U.S. slaves was as high as that in Jamaica. The birth rate was 80% higher. The average number of children born to an early 19th century Southern slave woman was 9.2, twice as many as in the West Indies, but this was because of forced breeding. Let's go on. It says, another important difference between Latin America and the United States involved the very concept of race. In Spanish and Portuguese America, an intricate system of racial classification emerged. Compared with the British and French, the Spanish and Portuguese were much more tolerant of racial mixing, an attitude encouraged by a shortage of European women, and recognized a wide range of racial gradations, including black, mestizo, quadroon, and octoroon. So it says, the American South, in contrast, adopted a two-category system of racial categorization in which any person with a black mother was automatically considered to be black. It has been said, half facetiously, that Southerners are colorblind in the sense that individuals, despite their racial composition, are considered to be either white or black, while Latin Americans recognize degrees of blackness and whiteness. And it says a final difference between slavery in the United States and elsewhere in the Americas was that only in the South did slavery depend on the loyalty of non-slave holding whites. Listen to this. In the South, 3/4 of white families owned no slaves. The key to maintaining their loyalty ultimately depended on appeals to racism. So to remain in power, the elite created the system of structural or societal racism known as white supremacy. They made whites believe that their skin color made them better and superior, and as a result, they were given certain privileges, and then laws were enacted to reinforce the lie, like having separate water fountains for blacks and whites. You can't let your lips get near to a fountain that blacks use, but you allow a black woman to nurse your baby and cook your food. And need I even mention that white men got even closer than that, if you know what I mean. But stereotypes were used to paint a picture of us in every negative way imaginable while stoking the fears of whites. Even today, most cannot even admit that our people are still being oppressed because of the very laws that were implemented long ago. Here's the thing. The pride of the nations involved in our captivity won't even allow them to consider that what they did is wrong. They keep trying to justify it, thinking that as time goes by, all of it will just go away. I had someone reach out to me to say that, well, all nations went into slavery at some point in time in the past, so they're basically wanting to know why we are making such a big deal out of all of this. It's the past. Forget it. Move on. It happened a long time ago. And all other people experienced slavery. Let me just say that no other nation endured what we endured in our time of captivity and for so long. The nations involved in all of this tried to erase the history. They wrote laws and used other gaslighting techniques to try to keep the truth from coming out. So let's just make the point here that the Most High is not talking about every nation. He's talking about the nation he chose to be his people. He made himself their defender. So he allowed what happened to us to happen because of our rebellion, but he still promised to hold those nations accountable because the wicked tendencies were already in them. You don't go around feeding babies to alligators, raping men, women, and children, separating families, lynching people, and partaking of their flesh, wreaking havoc wherever you go, unless it's already in you. Scripture said we would be turned over to a foolish nation, a nation of fierce countenance, a people who would not regard the elderly nor show favor to the young. So covering this information now is allowing us to trace the history and see that the barbaric things mentioned in the prophecies did indeed happen to our people. We are the witnesses that those things happened. Our people bear the scars. So yes, all of the nations that came into agreement to cut us off from being a nation will have to reap what they have sown. And it's going to be worse than they could ever imagine. Let's look at this from Isaiah 14:1 through 2. And I know I keep going back to certain scriptures to make my point, but it's worth repeating it. It says, for the Most High will have mercy on Jacob and will still choose Israel and settle them in their own land. The strangers will be joined to them and they will cling to the house of Jacob. Then people will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them for servants and maids. In the land of the Most High, they will take them captive, whose captives they were, and rule over their oppressors. This prophecy is not talking about any and every person on the planet who went into captivity. It is specific to the house of Jacob. So for Christians who insist that they are Israel, show us your scars. When were you taken into captivity and scattered around the world? When did you lose your heritage? Show us the pictures of your ancestors with the yokes of iron around their necks. No. If your heart is right, and it's the Most High's will, you will be one of the strangers joined with us, clinging to the house of Jacob. So don't get it twisted. We'll end it here and continue with the series next time. But if this message has been a blessing to you, please remember to hit the like button, share it, and you're welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. Join me next time. Be blessed, family.